One of the important concepts in bonsai is the concept of movement. Now, what is movement? How do you get movement? And how do you emphasize movement? The last one I will demonstrate on this trunk in this video. If you don't know what movement is, basically it is the curvature of a trunk. The more curvature you have in the trunk, the more movement it has. And it helps to create a more dynamic image of a tree. Also, trunks with lots and lots of movement typically are seen as more feminine, more gentle, more elegant, whereas trunks that are very straight are more masculine and often they are boring. Do we like boring bonsai? No, we don't. Hey, this is Jelle, growing bonsai, and today we're talking about movement in trunks, how you get there and how you emphasize it when it is only vaguely available in a bigger trunk. The best moment to create movement in a trunk is in the earliest stages of development. This is a sacrifice that I'm going to air layer off in a year or two, and I've wired out this part of the trunk so that later on when I air layer it down low, I have a trunk with lots and lots of movement. Next to this, I'm doing a little bit of an experiment where, and you can't see that, I think I am spiraling the bark. I have carved the bark so that it emphasizes the movement, and this emphasizing I will show later on in detail on another plant. But this is how typically movement is created. Next to that, of course, you can also say, well, I have lots and lots of branch material here. I'm going to cut this top off and I'm going to go and cut back to this little branch here. If I cut back there, then also I have movement in my trunk. It goes from upwards to sidewards. So this is what movement is all about. How dynamic is the trunk line? How many bends and turns and twists are in there? That is the whole concept of movement in bonsai. And the more movement, typically, the more interesting a tree is. Now keep in mind, there are trees where movement is not so great. For junipers and pines, it is normal to be twisted and contorted. But for a nice elegant Japanese maple, or maybe even an oak or a beech, long flowing lines without a lot of movement is much more natural. This is a personal choice, and that is where bonsai meets art. How do you style your tree and what shape do you give it? And that I leave up to you. Here it is about how do you do it. So I've already explained, right? You can wire out young whips as you are growing them out. But what do you do when your trunk is already a little bit more mature and actually too thick to bend? And when is it too thick to bend? Well, making nice smooth curves. If a branch is as thick as your thumb, it's already getting quite difficult. You can use advanced techniques, but I prefer to not do this. So I look for trunks that already have some movement and then I emphasize it. And emphasizing is what I've done with this tree. This tree I styled 2 weeks ago at a big show and I have a video on it, and I'll link through to that video at the end of this video. But before I did the styling, the tree was planted pretty much like this. And with that, this straight section is very visible. So one way to increase the movement or the optical movement in your tree is by making sure you don't get any straight, horizontal or vertical branch sections. Our eyes are very good at recognizing near perfect straight, horizontal and vertical lines. So tilting the tree a little bit aids enormously in creating a more dynamic view and making this less obvious. Next to this, I've taken these branches and I've given that quite a bit of movement, breaking the lines. Here also I've created a little bit of more deadwood, which will help in creating more dynamic view. And this lower trunk already has quite a bit of movement, but this is what I would like to emphasize in this video. So the first thing that I always do is I go around and I try to see, is all my bark completely alive? Are there dead sections? Can I just lift some of the pieces of bark? In this case I already cleaned a bit for the styling, but you remove all this loose flaky bark where possible. Why do you remove this? Well, this aids in seeing whether there's parts of the trunk that are already dead, because I'm going to kill off a little bit of the bark. Yes, I'm going to kill off a little bit of the bark of this tree. With this work, it is very important that before you take your knife and start cutting into the trunk, you first understand, are there dead sections already in the trunk? If you don't, you might kill off branches. There are live veins and dead areas in many old trunks. However, this trunk, I'm not too concerned. I am, however, therefore checking when there's a dead branch at the bottom of the branch, is the bark still alive? For that, I just scratch gently in the bark, and if I see it is nice and white instead of gray or brown, there is still sap in this tissue. Yes, I'm going to kill off a little bit of the bark of this tree. And why? Because that will emphasize where the lifeline ends up. Of course, you might have heard about lifelines already. What is a lifeline on a tree? A lifeline on a tree is the connection between a branch going over the trunk and to a root. On younger juniper stock like this one, typically every part of the bark is alive. However, if you look closely here, you see here this has a little bit of a depression. It might be that here already a part of the bark has died off. That section, of course, if it is dead, it can't create new sap transporting veins. So I need to check whether this is dead tissue or living, and I do that by just gently scratching. And what you might be able to tell, here there's a little bit of white and green, here there's little specks of white. That means that this is all alive. So this whole bark all around the trunk is alive. Doesn't mean that everything is equally active. So this section might be more active and that section might be more active, and this is not so active because maybe a branch such as this one that had most of the sap carrying veins through this part has died, and therefore this is now holding back, but it's not that. It can still be triggered in being used more, and that is what you do by emphasizing your live veins. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at this trunk line, right? This has a nice shape and I want to emphasize these curves. So this outside I want to get much stronger, this outside I want to get much stronger, and here I want to get it much stronger. So what we do is we remove sections that are not in the place that you want to grow thicker. If I remove bark here, it can't grow any thicker, right? But it also means that all the sap flow coming from the tree going to the roots will have to go through the leftover bark, so that will fatten much more quickly. And by doing this, creating little shapes here in the bark, I redirect the sap flow, emphasizing the curves that are already there. Now here there are some dead branches. I'm going to use this also, because everywhere there's a dead branch, the bark will be carrying less of the sap. But around the dead area, you get a little bit of swelling, and that again emphasizes the direction, the movement, the dynamic shape of this tree trunk. But as I said, let me go through this tree, see whether there are any dead sections. I don't think there are. Remove all the old bark, and then I'll be back with you. In this video, I'm using a number of tools. First of all, a strong carpet knife, an oyster opener to remove old bark, a steel plate to remove old bark, yin pliers, and or bend yin pliers, and or bend yin pliers. So now that we've confirmed that this bark is all alive, I can start looking at natural sap flow lines, right? Now this branch was alive when I removed it 2 weeks ago, and that is why all of this bark here is alive. I think that this branch here in the back doesn't flow over like this, but I'm not sure, so I have to be very careful that I don't remove too much here. So I'm not going to do any work. This already has a nice area of that area, but this here is quite new, and here also I'm going to remove the bark surrounding the cutoff area. And to do this, this is an awkward position to not show my hands rather than the cutting. I just take my knife and I cut through the bark around the area where I want to remove it. And then I take yin pliers, squeeze a little bit in the bark, and typically then it will be released. It is now the middle of spring, early summer, and the bark is on very loose. You can aid this by making a cut all the way along the length of the dead wood, and this will emphasize in the end the movement, because here in the straight section of the trunk, sap flow will go around these dead areas, and you create lines that are moving around the trunk, visually giving the idea of movement in the trunk. And now we've cleaned this area here up, and as said, this is still alive, this is alive. This is however very straight. And how do we fix this? Well, one of the ways to fix it is to create the visual idea that this is thinner than that. And how do you do it? Well, lighter material often looks thinner. So if we remove some of the bark here and make this into a shari, then it looks like there is movement in this direction. Furthermore, by doing that, and I remove it right up to the base of this branch, then the sap flow from this branch coming down will go down and then either up or on the bottom of this trunk. And here in the back I will therefore also remove some of the bark. Not too much, because I don't want to kill the branch, but I am going to stimulate that most of the sap flow from this branch goes down and back up. So I'm going to remove a moon-shaped, a crescent-shaped piece of bark here in the top. The spots where you can expect dead bark is typically behind one of these branches. This is the sap flow has stopped, and then typically you get dieback. You see here is a little bit of a depression in the bark. It is still alive, however. You see that there's a nice bright white shine, and that is typical for bark that is still carrying sap. But here I can remove all these old pieces of bark where it has died back, and you see how it has swollen here around the edge. There's also a little bit of swelling here and a little bit of swelling there. So here in the wake of the sap of course comes from the trunk, goes to the roots in the bark. This is where you have a little bit of died off bark and has swollen around it. So these areas I could emphasize if it weren't for all these dead areas where you have the same pattern happening. A little bit of dying back, but I could of course emphasize that more by cutting this out. Let me first clean this up further. Now I'll try and do this in a way that you're not going to look only at my hands, but that's not going to be easy. Basically I'm starting here at the attachment and I move gently down and then go back up. Very clearly cutting the bark, and then I have to try to get in between here and do the same thing from this end. And this doesn't have to be one cut. You can just make the first initial cut, start peeling away, and then see whether you need to extend. The cut is mostly a delineation to make sure that I don't pull off more than I want to. It doesn't have to be nice and smooth. In the end it is a tree, and it doesn't have to be obvious that it is all man-made. In fact, it's better if it is not obvious. So I'm leaving the cuts a little bit ragged. There will be a little bit of dieback, and over time there will be callus formation around the edges, and then it will look quite natural. Right now of course it isn't very pretty, but give this a few months and it will be a lot better already. It will stop evaporation, and with that the bark won't dry out as quickly and the edges will not retract, the bark will not curl up as much, and it looks less ugly than wood paste. There we go. So this is the first section done, and over time this will mean that there will be a little bit of swelling here on the bottom, top and at the bottom, aiding in creating a little bit more interest here. And at some point I might cut back here more on the top, but first I want this tree to realize, okay, I need to redirect my sap flow. Then here at the bottom, this already has movement, but we can emphasize that more as well in a similar fashion. So I want to highlight this movement. And how can I do that? I can do that by creating contrast in the bark. Right now all the bark is homogeneous, but I can create, of course, thin slivers in the bark of that wood. They will swell up around the edges over time and therefore create more dynamic lower trunk line. Never go all the way to the roots, because the roots sit in a substrate that stays wet. That wood that is in contact with water will rot a lot more quickly than that wood that is open to the air. So I always try to keep my shari above the root base unless I really cannot avoid it. Now if we look at this lower trunk line, already I said here is a depression, and I'm going to use that depression. So I'm going to basically remove bark in a crescent from this depression. I already expect the sap flow to be a lot less in this area, and I'm going to make the crescent more extreme than the actual bend of the curve, than the actual bend of the trunk. And that way I get a more dynamic feel to the trunk. So that's one end. And now I'm going to go around back all the way to here, including this little old dead stump. Now this work is quite easy to do in spring. In winter it's a lot harder because the bark is much more connected to the trunk line. And now I'm just going to allow the tree to deal with this. And to top it all off, I want to create a little bit of a moon shape here as well, so that this really becomes a nice fat snaking lifeline. So I'm going to remove here is a little area where there used to be a branch. I'm just opening this up. Not too much. Just a little bit to cut the subflow over this area and really divide it along this area. So this will swell up, this will swell up, this will swell up a little bit. And here in the top I could do the same, but because I've already made a few of these cuts, I'm now just going to leave the rest for next sitting. Always keep in mind, health of the tree is also important. A dead bonsai is not a bonsai. Now the technique I'm showing you in this video I applied on this tree about 10 years ago as well. However, I made a few mistakes. One of the big mistakes is I made the shari here all the way to the ground level. So this is now prone to rotting. You can see how it is discolored already. Next to this, I did create here a little bit of movement, which is hard to see from the front. But on the lower trunk, I didn't do it in the right way. I didn't emphasize the movement. I just made a long stretch down. This is a wasted opportunity. I could have much more easily created a lifeline that spirals around the trunk, very much emphasizing the nice delicate movement that this trunk has already. So keep track of that. If you watch the video, when you watch the video, look for movement in the trunk that you can emphasize and don't just remove whatever. And there we have it. Movement in this trunk, emphasizing existing movement and trying to create new movement in trunks that are really too big to bend and create nice movement. I hope this was helpful. There are a few things. Now, and before, of course, these edges are now really, really ugly. What is going to happen over the next year or two? There's going to be callus formation around the cut edge. Then, as the bark matures, it starts flaking off. And the transition between the cut area and the new callus formation becomes more smooth because I can continuously pull off fibers, and then the areas that I made with my pocket knife are going to be much more rounded, and then in maybe 2-3 years you won't notice that this is man-made. Right now, of course, it is very noticeable. Anyway, aftercare, I'm just going to put this in the sun. I have covered all these areas with a waterproof coat, and with that I'm not too concerned about any further dieback, and even if it does, that will just add to the character that I've just added. This was Jelle, growing bonsai. See you next time and keep growing bonsai.